Go.
Hi, this is Michael Smook for episode 20. Today is November 11th. It's a Saturday and we're in the year 2017. I'm speaking from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. The topic of today's conversation is a conversation with a coworker. Chapter 1, that's the title is Vietnam bad, Korea good, why? That ties into the overall topic of China today, because in those two wars, the United States was at war, technically, indirectly and directly, with China. Chapter 3 is entitled U.S. Managing Its Relationship with China. Chapter 4 is a conversation with a coworker, which is the same title of today's talk, and ties into the overall theme with China, stems from the fact that my coworker was born in China, educated in China, had a career there, and now she lives in the United States. She's an American citizen. She has two children, and she lives in the same county as I do, and works in Manhattan with me. So it all ties together, and it's relevant today for me now, because the president's visit to China and the meeting of the heads of state, including President Xi of China and the leaders of Vietnam, South Korea, and also Japan. So now that we've summarized Chapter 1, let's go on to Chapter 2, Korea good, Vietnam bad, and why. Now, the thing is, this is a 20 to 30 minute YouTube talk, and what I keep in mind stems from the fact that, unlike Ken Burns, who had 18 hours for an 18-part documentary on Vietnam, our time is brief, so I have to cut to the chase. Now, this is the thing with these wars in Korea and Vietnam. When the United States engages in a land war in Asia, and the North country is a communist country, and it borders China, we have a 50% chance of fighting to a draw. And that's what exactly happened between the two wars. In Korea, let's go over a few details about Korea. In Korea, the United States was engaged in a 3-year war. We backed South Korea with 25 or 26 other countries. Some provided military personnel, some provided weapons, some provided supplies, and they backed the United States. And then North Korea, which invaded Korea, was backed by China. And that war went back and forth. Twice the United States was nearly pushed off the Korean peninsula. And once the United States was fighting its way through Korea and nearly crossed into China. So at the end of the day, it was a draw, and there's a ceasefire. So both countries are technically at war. Briefly, just to summarize where we are now, 64 years later, North Korea has developed an atomic weapon. They're developing the means to deliver the weapon, and they are the means of the intercontinental ballistic missiles. There are 25 million people. They're heavily armed, but they're a poor country. South Korea, it's gone the opposite direction. The army is just about as big as North Korea, twice as many people, 50 million, and they have the 11th largest economy in the world. When you think of South Korea, you think of Samsung. They're an IT giant. And when you look at your phone, it's probably a Samsung. When you buy a car, it may be a Korean car, South Korean Hyundai. So South Korea is a free nation, unlike North Korea, which is communist. And that's where we stand today on the Korean Peninsula. In Vietnam, what happened is, it really should be more accurately called the Vietnam Wars. Vietnam Wars lasted 40 years. The Vietnamese fought the French, the Japanese in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and then the South Vietnam was at war with North Vietnam, and the United States backed South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese did not receive Chinese troops, but they were provided with weapons, supplies, logistical support, and strategy. So United States and China were indirectly at war during that time. So as far as Vietnam is concerned, Of course, we would have liked to have saved South Vietnam from becoming communist, just like we saved South Korea. But the thing is, if we could look at the good part of a terrible, terrible war, is that what happened is that Vietnam is now reconstituted. It's 90 million people. It's the People's Republic of Vietnam, and it has trade relations and political relations with China, but it also has the same political and trade relations with the United States. In fact, the Vietnamese are so enthusiastic about participation with the United States, they signed on after 5 years of negotiation with the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the United States, South Korea, Japan, and 8 other countries. So they'd like better relations with the United States. They'd like enhanced trade relations with the United States, which shows you how interesting history is. And sometimes we have to be patient and wait things to play themselves out. So the thing is that even though South Vietnamese, they needed to leave Vietnam after the war, and now with the refugees who've come to the United States, nearly all have become citizens. They're prosperous, and the refugees who've made it to the United States have children, grandchildren, and in some cases, great-grandchildren. So the thing about it is that things have turned out good, even though it was a terrible war. Now, what have we learned about the Vietnam-Korean complex? In particular, how can we avoid another Vietnam? And so the thing is this. There are a couple of principles we should pay attention to, but having principles do not always work. In other words, our principles leading to Vietnam was we believed in the containment theory, and the thing is, it was perhaps distorted. We relied solely on military means to hold back communist aggression, first in South Korea, then in Vietnam. And what we misinterpreted was called the containment theory. And what went wrong was we overly relied on military when maybe we should have emphasized diplomacy, economics, which leads to finance and business, and also intelligence. And we relied on military at the time. And George Kennan, who was the proponent of that theory, who advised President Truman, and it became the policy of presidents from after that, from Eisenhower to Johnson. George Kennan said that was misinterpreted. So these are some new ideas that I'm giving you that are principles we should use, that it's not a foolproof method. The United States still can get into wars, but these are things that we can do so we could do better analyses and possibly prevent getting into wars when we can just think our way through and use other means to find peace. This is what I suggest. First of all, as previously mentioned in another YouTube video on explaining America's foreign policy about a year ago, I said that one of the things we should use is the Powell Doctrine. Colin Powell was Secretary of State. Overall, he served in that in different capacities, 4 different presidents. Colin Powell was a great man and a great thinker. He's somebody I truly admire, and he's a stalwart Republican. This is what Powell said. When the United States is thinking about or preparing to enter into a war, Congress and the President should be in sync with each other. In addition, he said the American people need to be behind it, and we must have our allies lined up and aligned with what we want to do. Powell said that we need to come in with overwhelming force. We need to have a timeline for getting through this endeavor. And he also said that there must be an end strategy. And I would add to the Powell Doctrine and say that we need to have a plan for peace. With our allies, we must find the funds and plan to rebuild the country. Once we're engaged in a war, we may not know how much we need to do to repair a war, but in other words, we need to be ready when the fight is over, so our former enemies become our allies, and we could work in peace together in a post-war situation. The other thing that I want to add, which is kind of new, it's something I read, but I can't cite exactly where I found it. But what we need to do is we need to use what I call a virtual microscope. A virtual microscope will borrow from social sciences, and in order to, before we get into a war, or before we continue peace. There are 193 countries in the world. And what we need to do is we need to look at the history, the politics, we need to look at sociology. We need to look at economics, which ties into finance and business sciences. We need to look at psychology, and we need to look at geography. We need to look at what's going on in that country, in different regions in that country, and in different regions outside that country. So we need to do this in times of peace and in times of war. That's a lot of work, what I've just outlined for you, what we need to do. And so the idea of the virtual microscope, I read it somewhere, but I can't say where. So I'm inviting you to think about these things, and that's why I think that That's why I think that it's a way of the United States avoiding war, and I think that we have a lot of work to do. I'm sure that that the State Department, the National Security Council, our intelligence agencies, and also business-related governmental entities like the Department of Commerce and the Treasury Department and the Special Trade Representative for the United States. I'm sure they're working together, but maybe they need to work not only harder, but they would need to work smarter. And these are ideas that would better guide the United States in conducting its foreign policy. And of course, since this talk aligns with U.S. relations with China, and those two previous wars I spoke about are direct or indirect war with China, we can ill afford to have a war with China. And the whole world is counting on us, since we both account for 40% of the world's economic output. So now that I've finished with Chapter 2, let's go to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is entitled U.S. Managing Its Relation with China. Now, about this topic is concerned, let's look what China is doing in terms of the big picture. First of all, as a preface, what China has gone through in the last 40 years is a remarkable economic turnaround. Under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, China became a capitalist nation. It's heavily financed by the central government, but there is quite a bit of private industry with a heavy government oversight, and also government holds equity in some of these private corporations. Two of the largest Chinese corporations that are known to Americans are Alibaba and Tencent. So the thing about it is China is engaged in two ambitious programs to vault it as the #1 economy of the world over the United States. One of them is entitled One Belt, One Road, and that relates to China building telecommunications, transportation like bullet trains, water management systems, generating fresh water and sewage treatment, roads, bridges, hospitals in developing nations in Indochina, in Southeast, in Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and in also sub-Saharan Africa and in South America. So what China is doing is it's doing this building, but these are not grants, these are loans. And in return, some of the nations that are receiving aid from China are heavily in debt. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Western banks controlled by France, by the United States and Europe, have declined to help these nations. And I'm thinking of Ecuador and Venezuela and some other nations as well. And what China is doing is they're lending money, but in return what they're getting is they're receiving natural gas and oil. China is hungry for energy. Now, 80% of China's energy is generated by coal, natural gas, and oil, which are dirty fuels. Of course, China is also pursuing at the same time green technologies, which include solar and wind. So the fact that China is engaged in One Belt, One Road, and in particular, I'm focusing for today's talk on poor countries, but are in our backyard, South America, is a concern of mine. And it also points out that China is serious about building up influence in the United States. To put it another way, as one State Department said, American imperialism is replaced by Chinese imperialism, and it's happening in our own backyard. So it just, the whole idea of influence has me concerned, and the United States is the world's #1 superpower, with perhaps China joining it as the #2 superpower and replacing the former Soviet Union and the former Russia. So these are issues of concern of me. Also, what's a concern of me, there's another project China is involved in. It's called Made in China 2025. The Chinas took the template from the Germans, and now they're going ahead with that. And what the Chinese are doing is they want to increase their computerization or digitalization in China. So companies like Tencent, Alibaba, and other up-and-coming Chinese companies will not only work with General Motors and Microsoft, the Chinese would like to replace these companies. And they would like to be self-reliant on Western companies, so one day they could vault over and be the #1 world economy. Now, there are some aspects of Chinese policy that have me concerned, and I'm going to also mention that, and I'm also going to represent some changes of things we might want to do. One of the things that concerns me is frequently, although not all the time, but frequently what needs to happen when a company wants to come to China, they want to manufacture on Chinese soil. What the company needs to do, it could be an American company, it could be a European company, Japanese, even a company from Taiwan. If they want to come to China, what they need to do is they need to partner with a company that's representative of the People's Republic of China. And what they also need to do, it's a 50-50 split between the Western country, for example, coming in, and also what the Western European or Japanese company needs to do is they need to give access to the patents, the secrets, the secret strategy, or to use parlance of food, the secret sauce of making a product. They need to share that product with the Chinese company they're partnering with. And they need to give up all legal exclusive right to that patent. And to me, that's something that's a concern of mine as well. So what do I think we could do about this? Well, in my previous YouTube talks, I speak about what the United States needs to do to strengthen the middle class, expand it, and energize the American economy. The United States has been growing at between 1.5% and 2% a year, and maybe we could grow 3% a year. And also, what we need to do is we need to rebuild the country. We have trillions of dollars of telecommunications, the electrical grid, mass transportation, roads, bridges, all sorts of other facilities that need to be rebuilt. Trillions of dollars that need to be done. And I think that would energize the economy, and we'll worry far less if we're rebuilding this country than if a company like, let's say, Carrier Air Conditioner leaves Indiana and comes to Mexico. Of course, we want Carrier Air Conditioner to stay in the U.S., but if we're not successful, if we're working on rebuilding the country, then we're going to be fine. Secondly, we need to realize that we lead the world in so many industries, including big pharma, telecommunications, agribusinesses, and so much more. We need to realize all the wonderful businesses and industries which we're on top of. And the third thing that we need to do is to perhaps strengthen the U.S. negotiating with People's Republic of China. Is what the United States needs to do is we need to walk back and re-embrace the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you add the total economic output of the United States of America plus Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and 8 other countries, that's 40% of the world's economic output. What the United States should do is, and President Trump should do, upon his return from Asia, what President Trump should do is re-embrace the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then, once that's approved, he could come back to China and negotiate from strength and negotiate better trade deals with the People's Republic of China. And some of the issues that I'm talking about partnering with Chinese company and giving up our rights to patent protection, perhaps we could get the Chinese to compromise more in our direction. And it will make the United States strong. And at the same time, the Chinese get the respect they deserve. The United States and our trade partners will also get the respect we deserve. and it'll be a win-win situation, and there'll be a better balance of trade relations, and there'll be less of a chance of a trade war between our great nations. So that about summarizes Chapter 3, U.S. managing its relations with China. And what I'm suggesting to you, there are things we could do to better manage our trade relations with China. Let me mention one more thing. I think that if the United States negotiates from strength, also respecting Chinese strength, if we negotiate better trade relations with China, what we could do is we could find ways of coming to a better understanding about the Korean Peninsula, especially North Korea. North Korea needs to compromise in some way and make the world less edgy about its use of nuclear weapons. We're never going to take nuclear weapons away from North Korea, but North Korea needs to be assured that it will survive, and in return, if it complies with the West and China, that it will receive the economic aid and developmental aid that it requires. So now that I've added that, we've completed Chapter 3, and let's move on to Chapter 4 and conclude before we say goodbye. Conversation with a coworker. That day, a coworker of mine, the woman is well educated, has 2 terminal degrees earned in China, and she had a career in China, and now she has a career in the United States. She's an American citizen. She loves the United States, but she also cares dearly about her homeland. She comes into my office one day. We've never spoken about political science or history or U.S.-China relations, and out of nowhere, she just says to me, she looks me right in the face, and she says, Michael, America doesn't like China. And I spoke to her a bit, and then a week later, we had to have this conversation. In those 2 conversations we had, I never specifically received the response to my question, but I think what happened is, my feeling is that she watched the primaries, the presidential primaries, the presidential race, and she heard words about a trade war between the United States and China, and maybe that's why that feeling came away. And then when we had lunch together, I had a list of questions. I showed her my list, and I said, how do you want to conduct lunch? I have a list of questions. Do you want to talk about what you want to talk, or I could simply ask my questions? And she said, let's do it your way. You ask the questions, and I'll respond to them. We had a nice conversation for an hour. It was a brown bag lunch. I brought my lunch, and she brought hers, of course. And it was unremarkable, but a nice conversation. But at the end, she said something that really seemed important to me. My coworker said, I'm worried. I said, what are you worried about? She said, I'm worried about U.S.-China relations. And I said, well, could I ask you a few more questions, and perhaps it'll assuage your concerns? And she said, go ahead. I said, the operative words are planning and management. Do you plan and manage your personal life? In other words, to make sure your children are fed, they have a roof over their heads, food in their stomach, clothes on their backs. Do you do that? And she said, of course. I said, in terms of your career, it didn't happen by accident. Academically, you have a number of college degrees in China. You had a career in China. You're in the United States. You're getting accreditation here. You're working in municipal government, and you're working your way up, and you're going to go far. Did this happen by accident, or did you plan and manage this? And she said, you're right. I planned and managed everything. And then I said, look, the United States and China represent 40% of the world's economic output. Is that something that we should be talking to the Chinese, and they should be talking to us, and they have their policies and we have ours, and hopefully they won't come in conflict with each other? Is this something that needs to be managed between China and the United States? And she said, I agree. So afterwards, we went back to our desks. We're on the same floor. And I sent her to a text message. And I said, I really enjoyed this conversation. Let's get together in a month before Thanksgiving. And let's go out to eat. And it's my treat. Let me take you out to eat wherever you want to eat. And we could talk about U.S.-China relations, or we could talk about anything else, whatever you want to talk about. And she said, sure, I'd like to meet you again. But I want to do one thing differently. And I text back, what? And she said, next time, I want to ask the questions. So I think that's going to happen. We had a good conversation, and I hope we'll have another one. Before I say goodbye to you, let me just summarize briefly. The first chapter, second chapter, is Korea good, Korea good, Vietnam bad, why? And the thing about it is, there's no good wars and bad wars. It's really not useful talking about whether we won or lost a war. What's really useful is that we use certain principles, and I'm talking about channeling the Powell Doctrine, and I'm suggesting that federal governmental agencies, and as well as the president, use a virtual microscope at closely looking at countries, looking at social sciences along with business sciences and geography. So that's what I'm suggesting in Chapter 2. In Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, what I'm suggesting is how we could best manage U.S.-China relations. China is going ahead with two huge endeavors, one called, it's called One Belt, One Road. It's a $1 trillion enterprise, and it's being financed in part by a new Chinese international bank called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it's also Made in China 2025, is China's way of technologically vaulting way ahead of the United States. And so I wish China well, but I think the United States, our future is in our hands. We need to use our strengths and leverage it by better relations with in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what I didn't mention previously, we could do the same with the European Union and the United Kingdom combined. And we could enhance trade relations with these areas as well. And together, creating win-win situations, we could deal with greater strength negotiating with China. There's no victor, no vanquished. It's just a win-win situation that I'm talking about. Now that that's my conclusion. And before I say goodbye, let me just tell you that my name is Michael Smook. This is episode 20. Today is November 11th. It's a Saturday, and we're in the year 2017. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Until next time, goodbye and good luck.